Aloha and welcome to this screencast for new folks to Meteor. I want to talk about application structure because that's something that can be kind of problematic when you're looking at the initial tutorials. And what I mean by that, I just mean the organization of files and directories. I'm not talking about like the class inheritance hierarchy or other kinds of structure that could exist in your system. And the thing that makes things confusing is that unlike other frameworks which have a more opinionated approach to how things should be, Meteor supports a few different ones, and you'll see a few different ones when you're looking through the tutorials. And I think to understand why they are the way they are really requires a little bit of historical context. The three that I see most frequently, there's this kind of, I call it the hello world app structure, where you just have, a single HTML file, a single CSS, and a single JavaScript file at the top level. And that works, and that's when people are showing you, Meteor in 30 minutes kind of thing. That's what you'll see. Then there's a little more complicated one where there's client, server, and lib directories. Which was until last year or 6 months ago or something. That was kind of the recommended approach to building Meteor apps. And now with ECMAScript 6, the most recent version of, or a recent version of JavaScript, there's this new idea of an imports directory. And now all of a sudden the kind of recommended approach is different. And so I really think it's important to kind of have an understanding of all three of these approaches, because you're going to see them, and in fact there can be mixtures a little bit of them. So how does this all work? The reason, there's a couple things you have to understand. You have to understand JavaScript before ES6, and you also have to understand this idea of isomorphic JavaScript, which is a very fancy word for something that's not really that complicated at all. In Meteor, because you have JavaScript running on both client and server, there's really three different scenarios that you have to be thinking about as you develop your app. Some of your JavaScript really should only run in the browser, like a jQuery something, you're manipulating the DOM, or you're doing some HTML kind of stuff. Obviously, that's a browser-specific kind of JavaScript, and so that should only be running in the browser. Conversely, some JavaScript should only be running in the server. So you can think about like authorization and authentication kind of stuff. That doesn't make sense to run in the browser, because the user can control that environment. Okay, so you want control over certain kinds of code. It should only run in the server. And then there's this third kind of curious case of JavaScript that should run in both places, on the browser and the server. And in Meteor, that code is often associated with MongoDB stuff, with database stuff. And that's the code that's really this isomorphic JavaScript, where isomorphic means you have the same shape regardless of the environment that you're running in, client versus server. And so why is the MongoDB code isomorphic in Meteor? And that's because Meteor's built upon this idea that both in the client and in the server, there's going to be something that looks a lot like a MongoDB database. So on the client, it's kind of a simulated MongoDB database, and then the server really is one. But this simulation is good enough that a lot of the standard MongoDB API calls to create collections and so forth, look exactly the same on either side. And so that code, you want to have a collection defined on the client and the server. And it should have the same name and so forth. So if you have the same code running in both places, that's the easiest way to guarantee, that structurally these things are going to look the same. Okay, so that's why Meteor really wants to have some code that runs the same on both environments, particularly when it has to do with this underlying database stuff. It's replicating the database out on both client and server sides. Okay, so Meteor's not like, omniscient. It doesn't really know a priori where code should run. It can't inspect it and figure it out. You've got to tell somehow Meteor that you want to this, a particular piece of JavaScript, you want it only on the client, only on the server, or you want it to run in both places. That's the problem you've got to solve. And the different application organization approaches that I'm going to talk about, these three things, they all have slightly different ways of telling Meteor what to do. Okay, so in the Hello World app structure, and I'm using an asterisk to say I'm not going to go. There's a few details here that I'm glossing over because there can be other predicates and stuff that kind of influence it. But to get the gestalt of this whole thing, you just have to think of it this way. So for the Hello World app structure, where you can have just all your JavaScript code in one single file. The way that you tell Meteor is by these object fields. Okay, is client, is server attached to the Meteor object that you can use inside an if statement or use as the predicate for an if statement to kind of create blocks of code and ensure that they only get run where they should. And if you don't use one of these little blocks, then it's going to run in both environments. So here's an example of some code. It says Meteor in 15 minutes. And it was actually the way the default app in Meteor was constructed before, I don't know, 1.4 or something. When you just said Meteor create app, it would create an app that had just 3 files in it, no directory structure or anything. And so in this case, the app was named task list, I guess. So he had these 3 files: a task list.css, a task list.html, a task list.js. So let's look at the JavaScript, and what you can see is that all of this code in the middle is inside an if statement where the predicate is Meteor.isClient. So we know you're telling Meteor only run this code if this file is being loaded or executed on the client side. Okay, here we say if there was code that should only be executed on the server side, then that code would be in there. So we can load this code in both environments and ensure that none of this code will be executed if in fact this file was loaded on the server side. And then finally we have this third one that's at top level that involves Mongo database stuff. And because that's at top level and it's not inside one of these if statements, it's going to be executed in both the client and server side. So this JavaScript file is going to be loaded in both environments, and you use these conditionals to kind of comment out code, if it shouldn't be looked at in that environment. And a very common thing to do is forget that template.task.helpers, for example, you forget to put it inside an is-client, and it gets run, and Meteor gives you an error on the server side because it says, I'm in the server, I don't know anything about template.tasks. Okay? All right, so that's the Hello World thing. They've actually modified the kind of default app structure to be more like this ES5 thing, so you won't see that as much, but when you look at tutorials, you'll see that, and it's still a perfectly valid way to build Meteor apps. But as you can might expect, it's not that scalable, really. Okay, so before talking about our second approach, I'm calling this the Meteor ES5 app structure because it's the application structure that made sense prior to 2016 or even maybe late 2015, because up until that time JavaScript did not have a standard language construct for modules, okay, which meant there was no way to define a collection of code and say, some of these things are private, here's the public APIs associated with it. And there was no way for some other file or some other place in your code to say, I want to extract and use just this function from that file over there. What that meant, and so effectively what that meant was that the JavaScript environment, you just loaded everything into it and sorted it out later, okay? And that the order in which you loaded files was really important, because if you tried to execute a line of code and you hadn't loaded the file that defined the function that was going to be executed in that line, then you'd get a runtime error. So the idea that, okay, well, JavaScript is just this environment where you load a bunch of files and then you execute things and there's a single namespace, I mean, that works fine when you've got tiny little programs, but once you start to get significant systems, that gets to be, quite complicated to deal with. So Meteor, as we know, they can't just load all the files on both client and server sides, because some code can't run on the client and some code can't run on the server or shouldn't run on the server. And you want to be able to know what order your files are going to be loaded in, so that you make sure that if you've got a function defined in one file that's used in other files, you can make sure that first file is loaded before the other ones. Okay, so how does it solve that? You want to get past this just having a single file with these if statements. So what it said is, okay, well, we're going to define some special directories. We're going to define a directory called /client, and if you put a file in there, don't worry, it's not going to be loaded on the server side. Okay, and similarly, there's a /server directory, and you can put files in there, and you can be assured that they will never make them over to the client side. And then other directories or files are going to be loaded in both environments. Okay, and again, this is a simplification. There's a bunch of other kind of specialized directories for special purposes. There's a /public and so forth. But to kind of understand the concepts here, this is what's important. Okay, and then beyond that, we still have to know the order in which, even within the client, we're going to load them in essentially alphabetical order. Okay, and that's a really I've built some apps using that, and when you've got I don't know, a dozen files or a couple of 5-10 pages, a few forms, super easy to understand, super easy to get started and to make progress. And it made sense also because there wasn't really any other way to do it. You were just dealing with JavaScript, so that JavaScript pre ES6, so there wasn't any other alternative. The problem is when you start to make larger, more complicated systems. Now the lack of a package system in JavaScript really starts to drive you crazy. Things like controlling the file order by the file name in alphabetical order. That's not a good way to control file ordering. You start having to name your files a foo or something so that they get loaded first. That's ridiculous. And having a single global namespace that just everything gets dumped into. Again, not a good way. We've known for a long time better ways to do this. Okay, so finally, with ECMAScript 6, this relatively recent version of JavaScript, we have this standard language construct for modularity, and there's export statements and import statements. The export statements allow you within a file to declare what other files, what should be seen outside that file. And then an import statement allows you to specify in a file, I want these particular functions and objects from some other place to be accessible to me. Okay? So that's really obvious, and it's like about time because other languages have had this for decades. Okay, but better late than never. Okay, so now that we've got that, Meteor folks say, look, this is the solution, to our problems. Now we can completely, solve the problem of having to name a file foo, just so it's loaded. Now you can have complete control over the order in which you load things, because you can just simply import things exactly when you need them, and it doesn't matter what the name of it was. You just explicitly get it. The problem is, how do we do this in a way that doesn't break all the apps that we've ever had before in Meteor? And so they needed to create a backwardly compatible mechanism so you could still have the hello world app structure, and you could still have the ES5 app structure with a client and server. But we also want to allow people to use this import facility because it's going to be so helpful when you want to build big things. So what they did was they said, okay, well, we'll add one new special directory called /imports. And if you had an old system that had a /imports directory, you're out of luck, man. It's your system's going to break, and you're going to have to rename that directory or something. So that's now a new one. And the idea there is that any files in there don't get loaded automatically by Meteor, and instead you're supposed to explicitly import them where you need them. Okay, so here's the to-dos app from the tutorial, and it's an illustration of how this works. Now note that, so at the top level, we basically have three directories: an imports directory, a client directory, and a server directory. So we still have the client and server directory, and that's quite important to make this whole thing work, and you'll see why in a second. What happens is, as before, any files inside the client file get loaded on the client side automatically, and everything inside the server directory gets loaded on the server file automatically. But instead of having like 25 gazillion files inside client and 25 gazillion files in server, you only have a single file, main.js and main.js in both cases. And the notion of, and the purpose of that file is to load using import all of the rest of your code, which conveniently enough is inside the imports directory. Okay, so for example, your client main.js is going to end up importing all the necessary code from the UI subdirectory of the imports directory, which, user interface, this is going to obviously be client-side stuff, as well as, they create kind of just by convention a startup subdirectory of imports, which just says, throw the code in here that is the code you need to run when you're first initializing your system. So that would be like your routing files and user accounts and so forth. So that'll get loaded on the client side. And then in the API, they have another one by convention API, which is your kind of domain logic. And so there'll be some code in there that will be loaded on the client side. In fact, it might be loaded on both the client and the server side, but in this case, since we're in main.js, we're worried about client stuff. So maybe list.js and methods.js get loaded by the client side as well. Okay, if we go over and look at the server side, this main.js is going to be responsible for its startup, loading, this server side code, and then inside here there's some server specific stuff associated with lists, and it would be responsible for loading that, and then maybe these two files are also supposed to be on both the client and server side. Okay, so that's the ingenious solution with ES6. Now it's more complicated. You got to have imports, you got to have exports. You're organizing things a little differently. You got to make sure that you explicitly import and export everything, because Meteor's not going to load files for you, apart from these two main.js files. Okay, but the good side is that you can get a much bigger system once you start on this path. You can grow your system to great size and complexity and never run into problems with load order or a single namespace or whatever. You can control that quite easily. Okay, so ES6, the ES6 approach is more complicated than ES5. Some people complain about all these import-export statements. I think they're whiners. I don't see any big deal. In fact, I feel like it's actually a nice form of documentation to tell the user, the reader of your code, explicitly what other functions you're using that are located elsewhere. But it's unequivocally better as the application gets big. Okay, you can manage your namespace. You can manage your file names. Don't have to start having weird names just in order to control application loading. Summary: you're going to see all these three kinds of things for production work. Use the Meteor ES6 App Structure, and I want to just show you real quick that if you want more information on this, you just go to the Meteor guide, and we'll quickly bring this in, and you can see there's a section called Application Structure. You can go here and read all about it.